Okay, in order to do an actual back pressure test, we need to tap into the exhaust system prior to mufflers, catalytic converters, etc., because that's where they're most likely to cause restriction, which will then cause a blockage. So first thing we need to do is remove an oxygen sensor, pre-catalytic converter, somewhere in the front pipe, so between the manifold and the first catalytic converter or muffler. Undo it and replace it with a pressure gauge. So first thing is to undo it. Usually they're very, very tight. There is a socket that's available for removing them with, but at the same time normally a spanner will do, and even though it looks like I've pre-loosened this one, in actual fact that is the tightness of it. So we now unscrew the oxygen sensor. We now have an adapter and gauge, so the adapter screws into place, and then we can fit this vacuum pressure gauge onto the unit with the engine running and see how much pressure builds up. Okay, so that'll be the next thing, starting the engine. Now that we've set up the pressure gauge, what we need to do is simulate a blocked exhaust. So looking at the gauge reading, it's within the black bar which is shown on the positive pressure side of the gauge, and what we'll do is cause a restriction and let's see how it affects the reading that we get. So I'll simply bend down, jam up the exhaust. A couple of things will happen. One is you'll notice the sound, and you'll also see the pressure gauge raise. As I release, you can hear a massive exhaust whoosh. Alright, restriction. Notice the gauge reading going up, release, and it returns. So in other words, if we did have a blocked monolith on the catalytic converter, or the muffler itself was blocked, or something similar happened like that, that's the sort of showing we would get. This time I've taken the revs up to 2,500. Let's just have a look how, if it's any difference. Alright, I'll block up the exhaust. Now I don't know if you can tell from where you are, but the engine performance is drastically affected. You can hear the revs die down because it just can't get rid of the exhaust system. One more time. And you'll also notice the big gush of water, just showing the amount of moisture that does come through a exhaust system. Okay, for this task we're doing, I guess, what is the opposite to what we did before when we're checking the actual pressure that's built up in the exhaust system when we've got a blockage. This time we're looking at how it affects the engine vacuum. Now if we have a blockage or a restriction, then the exhaust gases can't be pushed out of the vehicle correctly, therefore that being drawn in is also restricted. So it should affect our engine vacuum, and with this experiment we'll see exactly how much. In order to set up the prac, we need to tap into a vacuum source in our intake manifold, and ideally we don't want to interrupt other systems. So if we used a brake booster line, we would need to make sure that was still effective. If we tap into our fuel regulator, if we've got the type that has a vacuum line at the top, again we don't want to totally disconnect that, we would need to tee into it. For what I'm going to do, I'm just going to tap into a vacuum source that exists on the throttle body here. It actually goes to the evaporative emission control, so for the short test that we're doing it won't have any major effect. So here is a vacuum line that I'm going to use. I'll simply pull it off of the throttle body, then with our vacuum gauge this time, because there's a vacuum and pressure, we will connect into the throttle body, and then with the engine running we should be able to see the effect on the engine. Okay, with the engine running at idle, we're going to restrict the exhaust system again, but this time we're looking at the effect on engine vacuum. So here we go, first plug off. What goes in? Okay, and if you watch the pressure gauge, you can see it building up. The pressure building up, that is, less vacuum. For release, you see it stabilise again. Increased blockage. decrease.